Well, welcome everybody, both those who are here in presence and those who are online and zooming in. We are very privileged and very happy to have Dorothea McEwan as our speaker this afternoon. And she's going to give us, I'm sure, something really interesting and exciting concerning Ethiopian culture from the 17th century onwards. But what I must say first is that we're very grateful to the Coffin Memorial Trust for making this lecture possible. And I should just start by reading out what the Coffin Memorial Trust is supporting. It was given to the University of London in 1956 by a certain Arthur Coffin in honor or in memory of his father, John Coffin. And it was, the purpose of the fund was that in the growing intensive specialization in modern times, we should not lose sight of music, the arts, and what the culture and the cultural aspects of education, and not the least of good general teaching on a sound religious basis. In addition to a part of the bequest devoted to lectures in Christian ethics, history, literature, and science, other parts are earmarked for the literary readings of prose or poetry, chamber concerts or recitals, and for the publication of reports by the Institute of Education. Mr. Coffin further states in his will that he desired each event to be announced as part of the John Coffin Memorial. So here we are celebrating the John Coffin Memorial with a lecture by Dorothea. Dorothea, as many of you will know, was born and brought up in Austria, where she did her degrees, was awarded a PhD. And then she moved to London, where she became part of the Warburg Institute, a very important part of the Warburg Institute, because she became the curator, the archivist indeed, of the Institute, looking after and publishing and making well known all the documents from the early time of the Warburg Institute, i.e. the letters, the notebooks and so on of Abbé Warburg himself, and his first librarians, Fitz-Saxel and the others. And so it was a very important job, and we are most grateful for the sterling work she did on this job. In 2008, she was awarded the Cross of Honor in Art and Sciences from the President of the Republic of Austria. In 2021, the Grand Decoration for Services to the Republic of Austria from the President of the Republic of Austria. But most of all, and most important for this evening, is that in 2017, she was elected Associate Fellow of the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences. So one might say to a very large extent that your heart is in Ethiopia, or part of your heart is in Ethiopia, and you have the rare distinction of being able to talk most learnedly and most passionately on Ethiopian culture and art, and it is to that we are going to be listening to this talk, this very well illustrated talk about images of the Gospels through Ethiopian and European eyes. Over to you, Donna.
Thank you. I want to talk about two very famous books. Both of them appeared in, one book appeared in 1591 in Rome, and the other book is an Ethiopian book, a manuscript book, sometimes in the 1650s. I will explain a few things as an introduction, and then show you some 20 pictures and talk a little bit in detail about these pictures. Centuries before the invention of the printing press, manuscript books were embellished with illuminations, paintings of the life of Christ to be used by clergy and by small number of individuals who appreciated and were able to pay for a richly illustrated book. With the invention of the printing press, however, printed books and images fed a new interest in biblical studies and missionary endeavors. Albrecht Dürer produced a series of woodcuts with very elaborately carved scenes of the life of Christ, the so-called Small Passion of 1511. In 1537, a Vita Christi with 186 woodcuts was printed in Antwerp and Ghent. Saint Ignatius appreciated the potential of printed books with illustrations, as such books would be tools for missions around the globe. He commissioned Geronimo Nadal to select scenes from the 4 Gospels, which were then engraved by the best engravers and painters of their time. Here you see the title page of the so-called Annotationes. Another book with scenes from the life of Jesus, called Evangelium arabicum, was published in Arabic in 1591. An Arabic language book with engravings was thought to be a necessary tool for converting the Orthodox Christians of Syria. This edition, to be read from right to left, contained 149 woodcuts, executed mainly by the Italian engravers and painters Leonardo Parasole and Antonio Tempesta. The 2 printed books by Nadal and the Evangelium arabicum, both of the 1590s, were teaching aids with a purpose beyond simply imparting knowledge, influencing the reader to a new way of understanding the scriptures and thereby accepting the Roman Catholic theology. The remit of the Jesuits to promote the gospel stories via printed and illustrated books in other mission fields in the 17th century is well documented. The Jesuit chronicler Antonio de la Vega, who described Jesuit mission endeavors in the Andean church in 1600, put it succinctly that, and I quote, "The Indians are better persuaded by painted images than by repeated sermons," end of quote. Whether this was the case in Ethiopia is undocumented, but overall the use of paintings according to the canon of the European heritage was thought of as improving insight into and facilitating comprehension of the text. Thus, European visual culture was used as part of the missionary strategy of conversion, that is, the visual descriptive message complemented by the verbal narrative message. I therefore wish to show selected pictures and explain in my lecture the question, what is transformation and how does it work? In the 20th century, scholars studying Albrecht Dürer and Tempesta, as well as the Ethiopian illuminated manuscript books in the British Library, among them Hugo Buchdahl, who also worked in this institute, made the connection between the Evangelium arabicum and the painting program of the tetraevangelium kept in the British Library. The signature OR510 with illuminations of all 4 Gospels. Buchdahl called OR510 one of the most outstanding Ethiopian manuscripts in the British Museum. In 1555, 2 members of the new missionary order, the Society of Jesus, founded in 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola, came to Ethiopia to reconnoiter the willingness of Emperor Galaudebos, followed by Minas and Sasa Denge. They wanted to get entrance to the ruling circles to accept and adopt the Tridentine Catholicism, the Church of Rome, that is to restore the Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity to an, and I quote, original bond with the Western Church. The emperor refused to submit to Catholicism, but tolerated the presence of the Jesuits. Their mission was neither substantial nor successful. A second attempt was begun in 1603. Now the missionaries gained access to the ruling circles, and Emperor Susenyos, who ruled from 1607 to 1632, was converted. So the missionaries enjoyed royal patronage. This was tested in the 1610s when parties hostile to the palace were defeated. In 1621, Susenyos made an open confession of Catholicism, thereby rejecting orthodoxy. In 1626, the compound of the Märtula Maryam monastery in central Ethiopia, destroyed by Ahmed ben Ibrahim al-Ghazli in the 16th century, was offered by Emperor Susenyos to the Jesuits on condition to rebuild it. The building they erected is today thought to be a palace and not a church, because the finely carved decorations, and here you see Märtula Maryam, Addis Ababa, the capital, and Gondar, the place which became the capital afterwards. And here you see another smaller, and now this is part of the Jesuit church in Märtula Maryam. The building they erected is today thought to be a palace, because the finely carved decorations do not refer to Christian symbolism, simply display the wider syncretistic qualities of the Jesuit mission culture. It is reminiscent of the roses and jar ornaments of the old Sao Paulo church and the cathedral both in Goa, the headquarters of the Jesuits in India, from where the Jesuits voyaged to Ethiopia. The stone decorations on the standing walls of the now roofless Jesuit church testify to a fusion of influences of Indo-Portuguese architecture, exemplified by the palace architecture of Gondar and its surrounding, as well as Jesuit, that is Roman Catholic use of classical architectural devices, to wit the anthropomorphic figures, look at that again, figures on the corbels. The buildings in Märtula Maryam, whether it was a palace or a church, and the church in Gorgora Nova on Lake Tana, south of Gondar, are said to be amongst the finest buildings the Europeans constructed in the whole of Africa before the 19th century. However, the building work in Märtula Maryam was interrupted by the political turmoil which dethroned Susenyos in 1632, because as conversions to Catholicism progressed, discontent among the Orthodox grew. Within a decade, the king had been forced to take back a number of pro-Catholic regulations. He died in 1632, followed by his son Fasilides, who had no choice but to restore orthodoxy, forbidding the practice of Catholicism and ordering the expulsion of the Jesuits. Their mission stations became places of worship for the Orthodox believers, frequently with the addition of a small traditional round church of wood and wattle and daub, squatting in the center of the old Jesuit stone churches. Many Jesuits left the country, while a few stayed behind in hiding. In 1666, Fasciletos ordered the burning of Catholic books. After the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1632 and the book burnings one generation later, the Arabic-only version of the Evangelium arabicum was considered non-European, non-Catholic, and therefore survived the book burnings. The German explorer Eduard Rüppel mentioned seeing one copy in the Kirkos church in Gondar in the Amhara region in the 1830s. I have been to this church, but I have not been able to find this book. During the sojourn of European clergy, their mission stations and mission residences had become places of transcultural elitist knowledge exchange between the Ethiopian and European clergy and nobles. Their multifacetedness, and in particular their way of presenting sacred images, altered and or replaced the Eurocentric examples. Its reception brought about the unfolding of Ethiopian art. Once Ethiopian painters had seen the Evangelium arabicum and its vivid illustrations of the Passion of Christ, a development took place in which the painters adapted these to the painting traditions specific to their own culture. I will show this with one manuscript book called the Märtula Maryam Gospel, or the Golden Gospel, which, having been painted one generation after the expulsion of the Jesuits, clearly reveals a compositional and intellectual affiliation with the European model of the Evangelium arabicum in the new style. The Märtula Maryam Gospel, undated, but of the 1650s, and still in Märtula Maryam. See here the outside cover, a lively cloth cover over the leather covers, and a sticker, which means it has a number by the Ministry of Culture. The images in this Ethiopian book nearly always follow the selection of illustrations in the Evangelium arabicum. They were not merely transfers of motifs or echoes of a foreign pictorial language, but new designs, patterns, and assemblages. The arts were open to foreign influences in book and later in wall paintings. The Ethiopian painters were faced with the question of authority. Who should decide, the artists or the clergy? What of the European landscape, clothing, etc., should be transposed into an Ethiopian milieu? And what was sacred in a picture and what was secular? The Ethiopian church painters made clear decisions from among the mass of details in the Evangelium arabicum, what to leave out and what to keep in. They transposed the scenes presented in the painted pericopes of the Evangelium arabicum into an Ethiopian milieu with their familiar points of reference. Thus, the detailed presentations of landscapes, of architecture, or rich clothing in the Evangelium arabicum were rendered far more sparsely. The ensuing results in the Märtula Maryam Gospel showed both adoptions and acceptance, that is, continuity with the foreign model, albeit in an Ethiopian garb, traditional Ethiopian imagery. The tension between innovation and reception, or reconstructive interpretation or reinterpretation, created a fusion of pictorial elements and ushered in the new style called Gondärine, or court style. The new artistic language became the common artistic language for centuries. European painting practice stimulated the Ethiopian painting practice and produced eventful pictures. The readers of such books were undoubtedly members of the political, ecclesiastical, and cultural circles. The production of such books was the result of an interplay with a community of artists, nobility, paymasters, scholars, and commissioning patrons. Doubtless, only patrons and carefully selected individuals were allowed to look at such books. The cost of production must have been considerable. The Märtula Maryam volume was undoubtedly a high-level commission produced in exceptional quality in an imperial or church scriptorium by more than one painter. Despite this, some illuminations are still unfinished, some halos just white blobs, some shoes just in outline and not filled with color. Let us look at some images exemplifying 5 aspects: architecture, the tentative use of perspective, dress, profile, and halos, which are the highlights of the new, sometimes entangled solutions. All examples are taken from the Gospel according to Luke in the Evangelium arabicum and in the Märtula Maryam Gospel. The black and white one is always, the Evangelium arabicum, and the colorful one is the Ethiopian rendition. So let's first look at architecture and interior architecture. In the Evangelium arabicum, I'll come to this picture again. In the Evangelium arabicum, the background scenes were often filled with landscapes or cityscapes and huge imposing buildings like you see here. In the Ethiopian images, such architectural settings are much less ornate. In this topic, the birth of John the Baptist foretold. In the Evangelium arabicum, we see the angel and Zechariah appear oversized in the impressive architectural setting in the background. In the Märtula Maryam Gospel, the magnificent temple in the background appears like a theatrical stage setting without depth, but still monumental in size. The next picture is very well known, the Annunciation of Mary, a homely presentation on the left shows Mary kneeling on the prie-dieu under a canopy, and opposite her, the large angel standing on clouds, arms outstretched, dressed in long garments. Both have halos. Between them is a vista of columns. Nothing of this is in the Märtula Maryam Gospel. Mary has a halo, and she's also kneeling on a prie-dieu, an open book in front of her. The angel without a halo is kneeling on clouds. A single turret behind Mary is the only hint of an architectural setting. Needless to say that a piece of furniture like a prie-dieu does not exist in Ethiopia. So the painter must have seen the Evangelium arabicum picture. So now I go to perspective, which is very interesting because we see various developments. The technique of perspective was used in the images of the Evangelium arabicum. It was only in the Renaissance in Europe that the modern theory of perspective drawing evolved, using mathematics for a more realistic treatment of the relationship shown between people and or objects. The effects of proximity and distance were skillfully applied when representing three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. Thus, when people or objects in the background were depicted as smaller than people or objects in the foreground, the images expressed something which words alone could not express as immediately or as clearly. In contrast, in traditional Ethiopian painting, the relationship between people and or objects was and is indicated by allocating places to people and or objects and paintings without giving authority to size, except for observing traditional rules which necessitated that important persons should be painted disproportionately taller than others, regardless of placements. That's why Jesus always appears bigger. They then appear according to a hierarchical or stacked up rather than perspectival arrangement. In Märtula Maryam, perspective is used, albeit tentatively, and not consistent throughout and less frequently than in the Evangelium arabicum. People or objects either in the foreground or background are not to scale. They appear much smaller than would have been correct. And here a glaring example left the Evangelium arabicum. You see the daughter of Jairus. She's lying in a bed, a very big bed, painted in perspective with three legs only visible. A splendid canopy can be seen above the bed with ruched curtains and bows. Jairus' daughter is half sitting in bed, surrounded by men on the left and women on the right, to the right of her. But in the Märtula Maryam Gospel, the daughter of Jairus seems to be sitting on a construction of three legs, which does not look like a bed, foreshortened as if in perspective. But the construction does not look like a bed. The woman sitting on it is enveloped by bedclothes like a large shawl, swirling all around her. The canopy is missing altogether. So here the use of perspective is attempted, but not convincingly executed. The miracle of the loaves, here the Evangelium arabicum strongly employs the strategy of size to show large-scale people in the foreground and smaller-scale people in the background, with Jesus not much larger than everybody else around him, but with a large, radiant halo. Whilst the background of the image in the Evangelium arabicum in a landscape with hills and houses, giving depth to the overall composition, the landscape in the Ethiopian picture is altogether missing. However, people in the foreground are much larger and people in the background are proportionally much smaller, so that one can speak of an attempted perspectival setting and understanding, but not convincingly executed. The nailing to the cross is another famous picture. This image is an example of Ethiopian paintings following the iconographical tradition of the Christian West, as the topic of the nailing to the cross, according to Hugo Buchtal, is not a frequent subject in the art of the Christian East. The topic is presented in a highly dramatic way in the Evangelium arabicum, with the cross in the center, Jesus lying in agony on the cross, soldiers driving nails into his hands, onlookers all around them, the instruments of torture scattered in the foreground. The Märtula Maryam Gospel version closely follows the European book, albeit the effect of perspective is attempted, but not really achieved. Another topic which I have selected is dress. Glaring misunderstandings occur when the Ethiopian painters were faced with images with European dress and uniforms. Clothing illustrated in religious scenes in Europe in the 16th century is more or less fanciful. It would have been considered inappropriate, if not sacrilegious, to show members of the Holy Family, disciples, saints, Old Testament figures, etc., in clothing fashionable at the time when the image was painted. In addition, there were no sources for biblical clothing or clothing used in Palestine, so anything vaguely classical was used as known to 16th century theater goers from theatrical productions. As the pictorial tradition for religious imagery was based on copying earlier manuscript illuminations, wall paintings and icons, the loose drapery found there was used. This applies to the figures of Jesus and the disciples. In the Märtula Maryam gospel, people are painted in Ethiopian dress, not in Euro dress, in undergarments, tunics, large shawls, shamma, elegantly draped over the bodies in red, yellow, blue, green, and white, some white red stars, or some small dot patterns painted, woven into, or applied to the cloth. European clothing, for instance, coats buttoned with toggles, was in many instances copied in the Ethiopian books, at times adopting European patterns, toggles, billowing capes, shawls, and veils, and at times disregarding these stylistic elements altogether in the Ethiopian rendition, as they were largely unknown in Ethiopia. In the European context, difference in social rank is indicated by more or less elaborate dress details, gowns, cloaks, shawls, reaching to the calves or ankles, denote the professional classes, the disciples and the doctors. Both groups are dressed neatly, and one cannot deduce any difference in social rank. In the Ethiopian context, social rank is indicated by traditional dress in good state of repair for the higher classes, or in tatters for the lower classes, and or only in the length of garments or trousers, either full-length garments or shawls, or short knee-length tunics and trousers. The circumcision or presentation, presentation in the temple. This is, have I got 2 pages? This is a picture where what I just explained is the European long gowns and the Ethiopian long gowns, but in Ethiopian patterns. The treachery of Judas foretold. This is a scene in the Evangelium arabicum where Jesus and Malchus are surrounded by soldiers wearing clothing similar to the kind of stage costume worn by actors playing Roman soldiers, with helmets, bases, breastplate, boots or buskins. In the wardrobe props listed by Philip Henslow, owner of the Rose Theatre in London in the 1590s, these are identified as antique suits. In the Märtula Maryam gospel, no garments of an especially military nature are to be seen. The soldiers are painted simply wearing short knee-length garments. Jesus in the 2 pictures embraces Judas. Jesus is bigger than Judas in the Evangelium arabicum. The composition of the picture, Judas standing in the center, Jesus standing in the center foreground, slightly taller than the man in the 2 groups right and left of him, and slightly smaller than him, he does not convey a perspectival composition, but rather an ensemble in which the importance of the person of Judas is emphasized. Jesus has a radiant halo, Judas is bareheaded. And now I want to show something to explain profile and Jesus in profile. The Ethiopian custom of showing good people from the front and evil people in profile is not always adhered to. Jesus' head in profile showing only one eye is an accepted way of portraying Jesus in European paintings, because in Europe there is no painting tradition, only one eye. But this is not the case in Ethiopian painting. In the Ethiopian pictures, judgment on moral values is expressed by the custom of painting a person from the front, that is with two eyes for high morals, or in profile with one eye for low morals. This artistic convention, denoting an enemy or an outsider, might be seen as a way of dealing with magical curses, causing harm to someone or something, otherwise known as evil eye. It is a belief known from classical antiquity, and classical authors offered explanations as to how a malicious gaze from a person possessing the evil eye would poison or harm another person. The evil eye is mentioned in the Bible. To reverse such a malicious gaze, saints were painted with two eyes wide open, as if watching the onlooker. And sinful and bad people were painted in profile with only one eye. Certainly, in Ethiopia, images were understood to be equipped with apotropaic qualities and affective powers. This painting of the Gerasene demoniac is very lively in the Evangelium arabicum. Left is a group of apostles and Jesus in the foreground. Right, a group of doctors and the demoniac kneeling in between them. In the center and in the background, a landscape, hilly, with houses and a lake and a herd of pigs rushing into the lake. In the Märtula Maryam Gospel, we meet again the two groups of people to the left and the right. In the center, a blue lake and a tightly packed herd of pigs hovering in midair, rushing forward into the lake. The pigs are only in outline. There is no indication of the banks of the lake or background of landscape. Jesus stands in profile with only one eye visible, like in the European book. His halo awkwardly placed behind his head, as if he had the head straight and not to the profile. So here you see a difficulty which the Ethiopian painters either didn't see or could not follow. This is a very famous picture, the Last Supper. In the Evangelium arabicum, the meal is served on a rectangular table with a tablecloth spread over it in front of an interior wall. In the Märtula Maryam Gospel, the table either has two tablecloths or a sort of flap. The legs of the table are not visible. Not all disciples are seated. Some are painted with one eye, notably Judas, foreground right. Some are painted with two eyes. There is no indication of location, either inside a house or outside. Objects like European furniture presented problems for Ethiopian painters. Traditionally, Ethiopians do not eat from rectangular or square tables with four thin legs, covered by neatly pleated tablecloths. and piled with many dishes of various shapes and sizes. The tables have only one large and round foot in the middle. They are low and made of basketware, on which are placed the large platters of the staple injera. There is no indication of the location in the Ethiopian picture, either inside or outside a house. And finally, my last example, halos. Painting halos that correspond to the movement of the head was a challenge. How does one show a halo from the back? Up to this point, saints with halos were painted as seen from the front, with their halos correctly hovering behind their heads like bright, round discs. However, in the Evangelium arabicum, halos were not painted rigidly like a disc behind a head, but painted following the movements of the head. And here you see, for instance, a good example of this apostle here. Although the halos are not filled, they are just white blobs. What was new in Evangelium arabicum were the scenes in which the body was seen in motion, feet being lifted, arms being moved up or down, bodies half or three-quarters turned, and most importantly, heads turned as well, with accessories in motion, swirling garments, veils, and hair. When a disciple is seen in full or three-quarter profile, his halo appears mostly correctly, that is, elliptically. But in the Märtula Maryam Gospel, the painters had difficulties rendering the exact shape and position of the halos. They could deal with halos behind people as seen from the front or in profile, but not as seen from the back. Consequently, the painters chose to paint the disciples in full or three-quarter profile, seen from the front and not from the back, as you have here in this picture. Even so, the halos often appear simply as blobs or appendages to the head. This is another iconic painting which you all recognize immediately. The Messiah enters Jerusalem. A crowded scene in the Evangelium arabicum and in the Märtula Maryam Gospel. To the left, the apostles are standing. In the center, Jesus is painted in profile and with one eye, with only one eye on a colt, his right arm and hand outstretched in blessing the multitude on the right, who are carrying palms and people spreading their cloaks on the road. And in this painting, my last example, the expulsion of the dealers of the temple. The Evangelium arabicum presents another crowd scene, people in motion, broken furniture lying around, Jesus enveloped by a swirling cape. His face is in profile to the left, with a radiant halo incorrectly placed directly behind him. That is to say, behind the right side of his face. The Märtula Maryam Gospel presents an equally vivid picture without the architectural details of buildings in the background. He holds his, he stands in the center, in profile to the left, both arms outstretched widely. The arrangement of the halo behind the right side of the head is incorrectly placed, like in the Evangelium arabicum, where Jesus is painted with only his left eye visible. So what is right, what is correct in the Ethiopian book is also correct in the European book, because in Europe there is no tradition with only one eye for the bad person. Both the interplay of foreign imports and autochthonous interpretation in the familiar biblical scenes were presented in new ways. The polarities of fascination and recognition, the introduction of ideas and their reception and reworking in an Ethiopian visual language connected two different systems of seeing and of knowing. The Evangelium Arabicum does present many landscape scenes with lakes and mountains, cities and palaces, but does not show the landscape or built environment or actual buildings of Palestine or garments worn at the time of Jesus. It is therefore not a presentation of views at the time of Jesus, but an appropriation as well as a reception of artistic motives by the 17th century Ethiopian painters, who conceptualized how things might have looked in biblical times. The Märtula Maryam Gospel presents a blending of foreign ideas, as seen in the Evangelium Arabicum, with Ethiopian image usage. The European visual language was transformed and translated into Ethiopian indigenous solutions. The nascent new Ethiopian style expresses a multitude of meanings and a new iconography for the old gospel stories. Different cultures see and represent things differently. When the Ethiopian painters encountered innovative details in the European paintings, with which they were not familiar, they could either leave them out or they could opt for keeping them in the picture. They did both in the Märtula Maryam Gospel. The interplay of these two strands is strongly present. The cycle of the life of Jesus and his miraculous deeds made up a great deal of Ethiopian religious literature. Cultural and intellectual life were imbued with these stories, but never before had they been seen as treated in the foreign book. This manuscript book, with its sumptuous painting programs, show the influences of the Western model as no other book until then. Where the image is seen as models or mirrors or instruments of protection or ways to follow, where they're seen as tools to better understand the sacred stories, where they felt to be authentic, that is following the accepted Christian tradition, or where they seem to be conflictual. How were the images interpreted? Did they show Europe to Ethiopians, or did Ethiopian painters emulate their European models to show a new Ethiopia to Ethiopians? Images as vehicles, image vehicles, as Warburg called them, transporting a message traveling along the Wanderstraßen der Kultur, the interconnected routes of culture, express new ways of thinking. They are conduits for responses and reactions. The well-known sacred texts were given a new visual context, combining imaginative foreign treatment with traditional images. The way the local painters and viewers engaged with the foreign style resulted in developing cultural resonances, easily readable when familiar, conservative topics were shown, and equally easily appreciable when new topics were shown in an adapted visual language. As such, the pictures in the Evangelium Arabicum produced a regenerative encounter, which took on a life of its own in Ethiopia, in fertilizing the Ethiopian painting tradition, nowadays known as the Gondärine style. We know that such works of art were held in high esteem by court circles. They were impressive and valuable. The images represented an aesthetic experience as well as an intellectual heritage. Sacred buildings, churches, and residences combined sacred and secular interests, institutions, and artistic practices. The large-size manuscript book, with its illuminations in the texts of all four Gospels, represent an indigenous response to illuminations in foreign sources, a cultural interchange. The new pictorial language had the functions of being an aid to conversion, but now produced an additional result, as this foreign pictorial language was processed or metamorphosed into a new Ethiopian painting style, the Gondärine style, which lasted much longer than the expulsion of the Jesuits until the middle of the 20th century. Thank you.